Hi, everyone. My name is Claire McCord. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a second-year sociology major. This is my presentation on practicing intersectionality in sociological research, a critical analysis of inclusions, interactions, and institutions in the study of inequalities. This was written by Choo and Marx Ferree. Before going into an outline of how this article is written, it's important to define intersectionality. Intersectionality is a framework that we use to understand how a person's identities intersect and intertwine with each other to ultimately form someone's experience of how they're treated in society and how they're viewed in society. It really is the idea that our identities are not independent of each other, but rather all work together to ultimately form our experience, and they cannot be separated from each other. So this article starts off discussing how sociological research interprets and includes intersectionality. And ultimately, Choo and Marx Ferree find that intersectionality enriches empirical findings, and that when an intersectional mindset is taken when approaching research, that more information can be found about the subject being researched, and more mindsets and frameworks and ideas can come out of research when we are looking at all of the factors that are influencing the subject's experience. And they say more attention to system-level complexity can enrich micro-level analysis, tightening the connections among power relations, institutional contexts, and lived experiences. So through this, we can see that Choo and Marx Ferree really see that when you pay attention to system-level complexity, meaning this intersectionality and the systems in place that really form intersectional identities and have identities interact with each other, we can really find out much more about the interactions of institutions and multiple factors that are influencing how subjects live and how they are responding to this research. And then they go into analyzing some examples of sociological research, and the two that they use are promises I can keep and unequal childhoods. And they really look at the ways in which this research is conducted and how taking an intersectional framework could have enhanced the research in these papers. And then they talk about ways to widen the scope of research and how we can better implement the study of intersectionality in sociological research. The first piece of research that they look at in this article is Eden and Kefalis's Promises I Can Keep. And in this research, they study many poor single mothers and are wanting to find out why these lower class women are putting parenthood before marriage and why they're having children before marriage, and just looking at their view and mentality that they have about parenthood. But there are a couple issues that are found within this article. And the first one is that it does not examine the reasons behind the mentality that the lower class women have. So a finding from Promises I Can Keep is, it is the perceived low costs of early childbearing and the high value that poor women place on children and motherhood that motivate their seemingly inexplicable inability to avoid pregnancy. So we can see that the authors, through this quote, don't raise the question of what is making their decision to have kids inexplicable, and really putting the word inability in there kind of ignores a lot of the factors that are going into lower class women's decision to have children. And in this study, there is such an opportunity to really look at what societal norms there are in the differences between socioeconomic classes, and it really could have taken a more intersectional perspective on the women's decision-making process and look at, as lower class women, as how that factors into their place in society and looking at how that compares to other mindsets that maybe middle class women would have or upper class women would have. And another issue that Choo and Marx found with this study is that the women interviewed are really examined from a middle class woman's mindset. And in their findings, we can see that the lower class women are painted as being harmful and dangerous parents. And there's really this mentality of save the children coming from the findings of this research. And there's just really a lot of room to really talk more in this study about how there are multiple identities that lower class women have and how this influences their decision. So there's nothing inherently really wrong with what Eden and Cathalis are saying, but more of what they could have said through this research and what could have been more beneficial to understanding the mindsets of this research. The next study examined is Leroux's unequal childhoods. And in unequal childhoods, Leroux talks about studying different childhood rearing practices in low-income households and middle-class households, and what the differences are between language the parents use, activities the kids have. And I think a great way to sum up what they found is with this quote. Leroux's data analysis is intersectional only in the static sense of street corner-like location where the different forces of inequalities cross. So what this means to me is that identities such as race, class, and gender are briefly mentioned as having some interlaps and some intertwining in how they are experienced, but more of kind of an afterthought. For example, a quote from Leroux's study is, "Race also played a role, particularly as racial segregation of residential neighborhoods divided children into racially segregated informal playgroups. Although race did not influence the number of activities children had." And we can just kind of see from this sentence that the talking about race as an identity in shaping how these children are raised is kind of an afterthought and just a little bit added on. And from this, we can see that they're really treating race as an identity that's separate from class. And so two analytic problems from treating gender, race, and class as really separate variables is that the intersection of identities is not seen as a process, rather as a location. So looking at where people's identities fall rather than how each identity is overlapping and how they are linked together to form a process of experiences rather than a singular pinpoint. And how I kind of like to think of it as our identities as not being individual bubbles, but rather a big mass that all influence each other. And that choice must be made between race and class is the primary dimension. In the conclusion of this paper, they really make it clear that their intent is not to diminish the findings of the examples of research that they used, but rather just looking at how the findings of this research could be expanded on if there had been a more intersectional framework. And that intersectionality is relational and not locational. And that when we're talking about intersectionality and the identities that people have, we are looking at it as a process of how there have been norms that get put into identities, and just looking at the relational process of how identities relate to each other and overlap. And that we also need to bring an awareness of the mindsets of the audience to our work, to research, and look at how people may be perceiving the groups that are being talked about. And they then talk about ways that we can improve research to be intersectional. And to do this, they talk about Roth studies, which talks about the separate roads to feminism that were taken by women in the social movements of the 1960s. And they talk about white women-specific groups and look at how being white women shaped their feminist movement, and really that shows how using the context of all social identities can bring more information. I really enjoyed reading this, and I think that at the beginning it was kind of hard for me to really realize what they were saying, because the topic of intersectionality can seem really general and broad sometimes, and unless you're looking at specific examples, can seem kind of hard to really understand what it is. But I think that reading this really helped me conceptualize intersectionality as more of a process, and helped me understand about how inextricably linked people's identities are. And I had actually read Unequal Childhoods in a different sociology class, so it was really interesting to look at it from this aspect with critiquing it, and really had me look at it in some different ways. And moving forward, I think that having read this, it will really shape how I look at sociological research that I read, and will also help me keep in mind to think about the broader picture and how identities are really overlapping with each other and how that might be affecting things. Thank you for listening.